Tell me your age, tell me your city, and tell me, do you believe secrets can rot inside a house? Before we begin, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear isn't a story. It's a confession written in blood, sealed in silk and whispered through the fog of Boston. 1852, March 12th, 1852. Boston, Massachusetts. The harbor reeks of fish and coal. The streets are wet with yesterday's sleet, shining like broken glass under the morning gaslights. Somewhere beyond the tremble of carriage wheels and church bells, a scream is muffled by lace curtains. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, the widow. 33 years old. Pale as the first frost. They called her the Whitmore widow, and they said her fortune came from her husband's death, a ship owner crushed by his own cargo crates. But that wasn't true. The truth was much darker. The Whitmore home stood on Tremont Street, facing the common. Tall brick, black shutters, iron gates that never opened to strangers. The neighbors whispered she didn't mourn right. They said she didn't cry. She just watched the world with those green eyes, eyes that counted, eyes that measured. Eleanor had two younger sisters, Margaret, 22, the soft one, Clara, 20, the wild one, both still unmarried, both living under the widow's roof. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and old iron. Eleanor's husband's portrait still hung above the piano, his painted eyes staring down on three women who refused to meet his gaze. The servants moved like ghosts, silent, careful, avoiding her study after dark, because that's when she wrote her letters. Letters sealed in black wax. Letters sent to men whose names she never said aloud. At dawn she walked the garden, not because she loved flowers, but because she loved the order of them, rows upon rows, like soldiers obedient to her pruning shears. And when she cut too deep, she never flinched at the bleeding stems. Boston in 1852 was a city of gossip. Every widow was watched. Every unmarried sister was judged, but nobody imagined what the Whitmore sisters were about to become. Margaret baked. Clara painted. Eleanor planned. Every night the sound of a ticking clock echoed down the hall louder than the wind. Tick, tick, tick. They called it grief. But it was really calculation. Eleanor wasn't crying. She was counting the days, the cycles, the possibilities. She'd been married for 11 years and never bore a child. Not because she couldn't, because she wouldn't. Her husband had wanted an heir. She wanted silence. Now he was gone. Now she wanted legacy, but on her terms. She didn't attend church. She didn't wear mourning black. She wore ivory silk, the color of surrender or the color of bones. Margaret tried to ask once at breakfast. Eleanor, why do you keep father's gun in the drawer? Eleanor smiled. Because it isn't for defense, my dear. It's for remembering. That was Eleanor, always saying things that sounded simple until midnight, when their meaning bled through. The city thought she was grieving. The servants thought she was cursed. Her sisters thought she was protecting them. But the truth, the real truth, began in her late husband's study. A locked desk, a hidden ledger, a list of names, men, dozens of them, each name beside a payment, a date and the word service. She read it 3 times, once with disbelief, once with rage, once with resolve. The Whitmore fortune, it turned out, was not from ships. It was from flesh. Her husband had run a quiet arrangement, wealthy men, poor girls, and unwanted pregnancies discreetly handled. That was how Eleanor learned the city's filthiest secret. Every respectable home hid a transaction. That night, the candlelight trembled. Her husband's face in the portrait seemed to smirk. And that was the first time Eleanor whispered a new plan, not a prayer. Not revenge, but creation. If Boston's men could buy shame, she would buy bloodlines. She called it justice. But it was really control. By the end of that month, letters had gone out. Quiet offers, elegant handwriting, large sums. She wasn't looking for husbands, she was looking for seed. Not for love, she wrote, for lineage. The first man arrived on April 6th, a dockworker named Thomas Hale. Strong hands, bad teeth, desperate eyes. He thought he was being hired as a gardener. He left with gold coins and silence. Margaret didn't understand at first. Clara resisted, until Eleanor said the one thing she knew would break her. Do this for our name. Do this so we never depend on another man again. It wasn't seduction. It was strategy. Each acting arranged, recorded, paid. Each night, colder than the Sisterhood, Boston whispered that the Whitmore girls had fallen from grace. They didn't know Eleanor had pushed them. The house changed. The servants left. Curtains stayed drawn. By summer, whispers grew. A doctor visited weekly. 2 sisters were sick with morning nausea. The neighbors crossed the street rather than meet Eleanor's eyes, but she didn't mind. She'd already calculated how many months until birth. She didn't cry. She just polished the silver. She didn't pray. She just planned the nursery. The piano stayed silent. The gun stayed loaded. The ledger stayed hidden. And on a humid August night, Eleanor stood by the nursery window and said softly, "One for every promise they broke." Because she remembered every man's name, she remembered every humiliation, she remembered how they looked at her. The widow, the property, the pawn. Now, she was the dealer, and she was just getting started. Before we continue with the video, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe, because Boston's darkest secret has just begun to breathe. Before she was the widow, she was just Eleanor Quinn, a girl with a ribbon in her hair and dirt on her shoes. Born in 1819, Roxbury before it was part of Boston, when the fields still smelled of hay and sea wind, when girls were taught to whisper, not to speak. Her father, Samuel Quinn, was a cooper, a barrel maker with rough hands and a temper that came in waves. Her mother, Mary, quiet as folded linen, taught her daughters to sew and to survive. The Quinn home was a place of wooden floors and wooden faces. No laughter, only the creak of the wheel, the thud of the hammer, the rhythm of labor. Eleanor learned early, noise invited punishment. Silence protected. She didn't cry. She just counted, the seconds between her father's boots striking the porch and the door, closing behind him. Margaret was born when Eleanor was 11. Clara, when she was 13, fashioned to 2 tiny mouths that cried too loud in a house that punished noise. So Eleanor learned to hush them, rock them, feed them, protect them, like a mother long before she became one. When Samuel's business collapsed in 1832, he drank his failure. When Mary grew sick the winter after, he buried her behind the church without tears. And when the younger sisters slept, he began speaking to Eleanor in a voice that wasn't a father's. That's where it began. The silence, the obedience, the learning to turn pain into stillness. She remembered every word, every touch, every locked door. She remembered the smell of whiskey and sawdust, the sound of his belt on the wall before it struck her skin. But she didn't cry. She just waited. She waited for the day she could leave. When she turned 16, she met Jonathan Whitmore, son of a shipping magnate 12 years older, with soft hands and hard eyes. He saw her not as a girl, but as an investment, and she saw him as escape. The wedding was quiet, respectable, arranged like a transaction between 2 desperate souls. Roxbury lost a daughter. Beacon Hill gained a wife. The Whitmore mansion was a world of chandeliers, imported rugs, and servants who never met her eyes. Jonathan brought her roses that wilted in a day and rules that never did. He believed in ownership, of ships, of servants of her. Eleanor learned to move like a shadow, to breathe without sound, to smile only when watched. He liked control. She gave him compliance until compliance became her weapon. He'd say, "You're mine," and she'd answer, "Of course." But in her mind, she repeated a different phrase, "Not forever." He built his empire on deceit and women's suffering. While he hosted dinners for Boston's elite, poor girls from the docks served unseen purposes in the house's back rooms. Eleanor pretended not to know, until she couldn't. It was winter, 1847, snow against the window. A girl, no older than Clara, collapsed in the hallway, bleeding, whispering for her mother. Jonathan stepped over her like she was spilled wine. That was the night Eleanor's love, if it had ever been love, froze into something sharper. She stayed silent, because silence was armor. But she began to remember everything, every girl, every lie, every smirk at dinner when men toasted to good breeding. When Jonathan died 5 years later, crushed beneath cargo in his own warehouse, Boston called it a tragedy. Eleanor called it balance. She didn't cry at his funeral. She just stood beneath her veil and thought, now the house is mine, but inheritance comes with ghosts. Every hallway whispered with his voice. Every mirror reflected what he'd done. Margaret and Clara moved in after the funeral, believing their sister needed company. They didn't know the house itself was a wound, and Eleanor was learning to live inside it. Margaret, gentle, wanted laughter again. She baked. She sang. She filled rooms with life. Clara painted the harbor, wrote letters to poets, dreamed of Paris. They both believed in beauty. Eleanor believed in control. Boston society watched them like hawks. 3 unmarried women, living without a man, rich but rumored. The churches preached that a woman alone invited sin. Eleanor smiled through it all. She'd been judged before. Judgment was a smaller pain, but at night she read the ledger again. Every name, every payment, Jonathan's handwriting. There was Henry Lowell, the banker, Dr. Matthew Crane, the physician, Isaac Pritchard, the preacher, men who spoke of virtue by day and paid for silence by night. That ledger became her scripture. Her father had taught her fear, her husband had taught her deceit. Now she would teach the city what it meant to pay. The idea came quietly, not because she wanted to hurt, but because she wanted to invert. If men could use women's bodies for power, she would use men's bodies for freedom. It started with questions whispered to the midwife. How long does it take to conceive? Can it be arranged? How much does a desperate man cost? The midwife's hands trembled as she answered, Mrs. Whitmore, such things are unnatural. Eleanor smiled. So was my husband. That night she wrote her first letter, and when she sealed it with wax, she felt something like peace, because the pain of her past had found purpose. Every humiliation had a price, every silence had a weight, every man's crime had an heir to replace him. On her terms, Margaret didn't understand. She thought Eleanor's madness came from grief. Clara saw glimpses and called it ambition. Neither knew it came from memory. Because Eleanor remembered everything, the smell of sawdust and blood, the sound of her mother's cough, the slap of her husband's ringed hand. She remembered the weight of men's power, and she'd vowed never again. When the first transaction succeeded, when the first payment was made, when Margaret blushed and cried in shame, Eleanor didn't comfort her. She just said, we are not the sinners here. Margaret asked, then who is? Eleanor looked at her reflection in the window. All of them. Boston kept moving outside, oblivious, the bells, the smoke, the carriages. But inside the Whitmore house, the air thickened with memory. 3 sisters trapped in a legacy of men, and one of them writing her own gospel of reversal. The past didn't haunt Eleanor. It fueled her. It whispered in her ear every night, reminding her that suffering could be inherited or redirected. And when she saw the first signs of life in her sisters' bellies, she whispered again, one for every promise they broke. Because to her, each child was justice. Each cry would echo the silence she'd endured. Each birth, a monument to survival disguised as scandal. They called it madness. It was really mathematics. Pain multiplied, transposed, rewritten into lineage. She'd been shaped by men, but she would sculpt the next generation herself. Summer 1853. Boston air hung heavy, smelling of smoke, salt, and sweat. The harbor choked with merchant ships. The city pulsed with talk of progress, factories, rail lines, fortunes. But on Tremont Street, behind iron gates, the Whitmore mansion sat like a tomb that refused to decay. Inside, the clock ticked slower than time itself. The house had grown swollen with heat and secrecy. The sisters barely spoke. Margaret, 6 months with child, spent her days sitting by the window, sewing tiny garments she didn't smile at. Clara, her belly only beginning to show, painted feverishly. Canvases filled with faceless figures and crimson skies. And Eleanor, she moved through the halls like a conductor of silence, her mind sharper than ever, her voice colder. She didn't cry. She just calculated. Each morning she counted the weeks on her ledger, each night she rewrote her plan. But something had changed. The neighbors had started to notice. A milkman whispered to the butcher, who whispered to his wife, who told the church. 3 sisters, 1 house, 2 pregnancies, no husband, no visitors. No shame, Boston loved its gossip more than its God. By July, the newspapers hinted at a scandal among the wealthy widows of Tremont. By August, a minister spoke in sermon about unnatural conduct in the homes of the privileged. By September, there were knocks at the door, investigators, moral committees, and curious eyes hiding behind lace fans. Eleanor answered every visitor with grace. "Rumors," she said, her tone honey and venom, but she could feel the walls shifting, because Margaret was breaking. Her hands trembled when she sewed. She cried in her sleep. She whispered to Eleanor, "I can't bear this. I don't know who I am anymore." Eleanor stroked her hair and said softly, "You're the beginning of something, my dear. They will never own us again." But Margaret didn't believe her. Margaret believed in love, in forgiveness, in heaven, things Eleanor had long buried. One night, Margaret tried to run. The servant caught her by the back gate, barefoot, clutching a rosary, whispering, "I can't do this." Eleanor came herself to fetch her. In the moonlight, her eyes glinted like glass. "You can," she said. "You will." The next morning, Margaret's rosary was gone and her door was locked from the outside. Clara saw it. Clara, the painter, the dreamer. She saw what her sister had become, and for the first time, she feared her. "Eleanor," she whispered, "this isn't justice. This is punishment." Eleanor smiled, small and sad. "Justice is punishment." Clara wanted to fight back, but her own body betrayed her. The sickness, the swelling, the weight. Eleanor fed her broth and kept her close. "You'll thank me one day." But in Clara's mind, a rebellion bloomed. Outside, the autumn wind began to change the air. Boston leaves turned brittle, orange and copper, the color of fading blood. Church. Bells tolled like warnings, and from every corner of the city came whispers of the cursed Whitmore sisters. The newspapers called her the Widow of Sin Street. Pamphlets circulated about female corruption. Men who'd once taken her money now condemned her. Eleanor didn't flinch. She read every headline, every sermon, every lie. "They called it madness," she murmured, "but it's really memory." The scandal didn't scare her. It enraged her, because it was men again, rewriting women's pain into shame. She began burning letters in the fireplace, all the records, all the names, all the payments. The smoke filled the parlor with the smell of ash and perfume. Margaret sobbed upstairs. Clara painted downstairs. And Eleanor watched the flames and whispered, "If they want a witch, I'll give them one." But even fire has its cost. The ledger, the one she'd kept hidden under the floorboard, vanished. She searched every drawer, every cupboard, every trunk, gone. Someone had taken it. That night, thunder rolled over the harbor, rain against glass. Lightning lit the corridors white. And Eleanor's calm began to crack. She gathered her sisters in the study. "Who has it?" she demanded. Margaret cried, "I don't even know what you mean." Clara met her gaze, trembling but defiant. "I took it." Eleanor's breath froze. "Why?" "Because it's wrong," Clara said. "All of it." "You've turned our bodies into weapons. You've turned our home into hell." Eleanor stepped closer. "The world made us weapons first. I'm only returning what they gave." Clara shook her head. "No, you're becoming them." Eleanor's hand trembled. She almost struck her, but she didn't. She just whispered, "You don't understand yet." That night, the rain didn't stop. Eleanor sat in her husband's old chair, staring at the portrait. She spoke to it like confession. "They called you a man of honor. They called me your prize. But look now, Jonathan, who's the master of the house?" Lightning flashed. The portrait seemed to sneer. She poured herself a drink, but it trembled in her hand. Because beneath all her control, something had begun to shift, not outside, but inside. Her sisters were no longer obedient. The city was no longer blind, and the truth, her truth, was unraveling faster than she could sew it back together. In October, Margaret gave birth. The child was stillborn. The midwife screamed. Clara fainted. Eleanor didn't move. She just stared at the tiny, lifeless form and said, "One was always meant to be lost." The words slipped out before she could stop them. The room fell silent. Clara looked at her, horror in her eyes. "What are you?" Eleanor whispered, "A survivor." But she wasn't sure anymore because as she looked at Margaret's pale face, at the dead child wrapped in linen, she felt the old ghost rise, her father's voice, her husband's shadow, whispering that she'd become what she hated. She locked herself in her room for 3 days. No light. No sound, just memory, thick, suffocating, circling her like vultures. She remembered the barrel shop, the belt, the smell of blood and wood smoke. She remembered Jonathan's parties, the laughter, the girls who vanished. She remembered every humiliation, every bruise, every name. And then she remembered Margaret's child, the one she couldn't save. She didn't cry. She just burned her dress. Then, barefoot, she walked into the nursery and whispered, "The next will live, even if I must kill to make it." So, that was the moment the breaking point came. Not from the world outside, but from within. She was no longer building justice. She was feeding vengeance, and vengeance, like hunger, never ends. By winter, Eleanor had a new plan, colder, darker. If men wanted to destroy her name, she would destroy theirs, one by one. Because somewhere in the city, someone held her ledger, and that meant someone knew the truth. The widow of Tremont Street was about to hunt. December 1853. Boston frozen. The harbor stiff with ice. Ships moored like corpses in white shrouds. The streets reek of coal smoke, salt, and sin. Inside the Whitmore house, every fire burned too long, every mirror covered in black cloth. Margaret lay weak in her bed, refusing food. Clara locked herself in the art room, painting only in shades of grey. And Eleanor and she wrote letters again, but not to hire men this time, to summon ghosts. Each letter bore a single line. "Do you remember what you paid for?" Each sealed in red wax, each sent to the names she remembered best. Henry Lowell, Matthew Crane, Isaac Pritchard. She wrote their names slowly, precisely, like carving on tombstones. They thought the past was buried. She was digging it up with her own hands. Henry Lowell was the first, the banker, fat, powdered, fond of cigars and choir seats. He received her letter at his counting house and felt his pulse skip. He burned it, or thought he did. That night, Eleanor appeared at his door. She wore black velvet gloves and a calmness that frightened him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he stammered. "What brings you—" "Memory," she said. He tried to close the door. She stepped inside. The firelight hit her eyes, green like bottle glass. "You paid my husband," she said softly. "For girls." For silence. "Madam, I do not lie. I've come for payment." He reached for the bell cord to summon his servant, but Eleanor was faster. The poker from the hearth wasn't for warmth. It was for remembering. 1 swing, 2. The room filled with the smell, of iron and smoke. He didn't scream long. She wiped the poker clean on his ledger and whispered, "1 for every promise you broke." Next was Dr. Matthew Crane, a physician of reputation, the kind who smiled too long and touched too freely. He had delivered Margaret's stillborn child. He had said, "Nature knows what to keep and what to discard." Eleanor remembered that sentence more than any prayer. She waited outside his office, hidden beneath her veil. When he closed his clinic, she followed him through the alleyways, slick with frost. He didn't notice until he reached his carriage. "Mrs. Whitmore?" He gasped. "You shouldn't be—" "I'm exactly where I should be." He tried to laugh it off, to charm her with that professional sympathy. But when she pulled the scalpel from her sleeve, his own tool, he realized too late. "The scalpel wasn't for surgery," she whispered. "It was for remembering. No witnesses. Only the sound of wind through alleyways and the soft thud of a body in the snow." Isaac Pritchard was last, and the preacher he had preached against, her from the pulpit, called her the widow Jezebel, condemned. Her sisters condemned her womb. He was the one who had received Jonathan's first payment, the one who had blessed the deals in secret, the one who'd buried her mother. She found him in the church late one night, arranging candles for Sunday Mass. The air smelled of wax and cold stone. Her footsteps echoed like judgment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered, "repent before it's too late." "It is too late," she said. "For you." He lifted the Bible, she lifted the pistol. Her husband's pistol. The one she'd kept for remembering. "The Lord sees all." He cried, "So do I." The gunshot cracked through the nave. The candles trembled. And for a moment, the church smelled like incense and gunpowder. She walked forward, calm, deliberate, placed the pistol on the altar. "They called it scripture," she murmured, but it was really silence. Then she left into the snow, into the dark. By the end of that week, Boston buzzed with terror. 3 men, dead, each found with a single red wax seal nearby, each known to have dealt with Jonathan Whitmore years before. The papers called it the Red Widow. Murders, the city trembled. But in the Whitmore mansion, Eleanor sat by the fire, her hands steady, her mind clearer than ever. Margaret slept, feverish, murmuring prayers. Clara stood by the window, Stu Hale watching the snow. "Did you do it?" Clara asked. Eleanor didn't answer. Clara whispered, "You killed them." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I remembered them." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You've damned us all." "Perhaps. But damnation is freedom if you choose it." That night, Clara packed her things. She left without a word. Into the blizzard, Eleanor didn't follow. She just watched the door close and whispered, "One leaves. One stays. One must carry the fire." By February, the city was hunting her. Posters, rumors, police raids. The mansion searched. The servants questioned. They found the ashes of letters. They found red wax. They found no proof, because proof had burned. Eleanor sat in her study, surrounded by silence. Margaret's breath shallow upstairs, Clara's room empty. And for the first time, she felt the weight of it all pressing on her chest, not guilt, but gravity. She walked through every room, touching the walls, the furniture, the piano. Each object whispered the same thing: "It's over." She lit one last candle, opened the nursery door. Inside, the cradle rocked gently, empty but still moving. The wind, perhaps, or memory. She sat beside it and spoke aloud, not to anyone, but to herself. They called it sin, but it was survival. They called it vengeance, but it was memory. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she saw him, not really there, but in her mind, Jonathan Whitmore standing by the door, smiling that smug smile. "You've become me," the ghost said. Eleanor shook her head. "No, I ended you." But the portrait still hung above the fireplace, and in the flickering light, it seemed to laugh. She took the poker from the hearth, the same one she'd used on Henry Lowell, and she struck the portrait, again and again until the frame splintered and the face disappeared beneath. "Sir," then she whispered, "now it's done. Outside, sirens, or what passed for them in 1853, bells, shouts, the sound of boots in snow. They were coming." Eleanor stood, straightened her dress, fixed her hair, and when the door burst open, she turned to face them, calm, regal, unflinching. The pistol lay on the table, the ledger in the fire, and she said one final thing before they took her away. "Tell them. I only remembered what they forgot." Boston, March 1854. Snow melting into grey sludge. The air thick with rumor. The Boston Daily Courier printed the headline in ink darker than the truth. "The Red Widow arrested. Whitmore scandal ends in blood." People read it at breakfast tables, on carriages, in parlors. Some whispered pity, most whispered thrill. A woman who killed men. It was both horror and entertainment. Eleanor Whitmore sat in her cell at Charles Street Jail. Cold stone. Dripping water. Iron bars that rattled when the wind passed through the cracks. She didn't cry. She just counted. 3 steps from cot to wall, 7 cracks in the ceiling. 2 nights since she'd slept. Margaret was gone. The fever had taken her the day after the arrest. Clara, no one knew, vanished into the wind. Some said she'd taken passage to France. Some said she'd thrown herself into the arbor. Eleanor knew better. She knew Clara had inherited the silence. The trial began in April. Crowds filled the courtroom, men in black coats, women clutching handkerchiefs, reporters scratching every word. They called her names: murderess, Jezebel, witch. Eleanor sat straight, her hair pinned, her gaze steady. They expected madness. She gave them poise. They expected tears. She gave them truth. The prosecutor listed every crime: Henry Lowell, banker; Dr. Matthew Crane, physician; Reverend Isaac Pritchard, preacher; 3 pillars of society, 3 corpses tied to her hand. When asked to speak, she said only, "I repaid what was owed." Gasps rippled through the court. The judge thundered, "Do you deny killing these men?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Do you deny they deserved it?" Silence and only the scratching of pens. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Each day she sat the same, unmoving, unbroken. They brought witnesses: servants, doctors, ministers. Men who claimed she'd corrupted her sisters, defiled her home, poisoned decency itself. No one spoke of the ledger. No one spoke of the payments. The girls the shame, because in Boston, sin was never male. When they read the verdict, guilty of 3 counts of murder, she didn't flinch. She just said, "History will remember the wrong name." They sentenced her to hang. Execution scheduled for June 2, 1854. At dawn, the city prepared like it was theatre. Tickets sold for viewing from rooftops. Preachers wrote sermons about her fall. Pamphlets sold with titles like Confession of the Red Widow, none written by her, but in her cell she wrote her own. A letter, 23 pages long, addressed simply, "To my sister Clara, and to the daughters who may yet come." In it, she didn't beg forgiveness. She wrote about the barrel shop, about the ledger, about the blood that built men's fortunes. She wrote about silence, how it kills slower than knives. They called it madness, she wrote. It was memory, they called it sin. It was survival. She ended the letter with the same line she'd whispered for years, one for every promise they broke. Then she sealed it in red wax, the color of truth. The morning of June 2nd came grey and cold, rain in the air, gulls crying over the harbor. They took her from her cell in a black carriage, chains at her wrists. Crowds lined the street. Some jeered, some prayed. She didn't look at them. She looked at the sky, pale silver, like the inside of a mirror. At the gallows, the hangman asked if she had any last words. She smiled. "Tell Boston," she said, "that a woman's memory weighs more than their laws." And then silence, no scream, no struggle, just the creak of rope and the wind through the common. They buried her outside consecrated ground. No marker. No name. Only a wooden stake with the number 47. But names have a way of surviving even when bodies do not. Months later, a letter arrived at the Boston Courier. No return address. Inside, a child's birth record. Mother Clara. Whitmore. Father unknown. Date August 20th, 1854. Attached was a note in familiar handwriting. She will be raised to remember. The editor never printed it, but the legend spread anyway. They said the child grew up under another name. They said she painted. They said she moved to New York, then Paris. They said her art was full of women who stared straight through the canvas, unblinking. They said the Whitmore bloodline didn't die. It learned to hide. In Boston, the mansion stood empty for years, windows boarded, ivy crawling up its brick walls. Children dared each other to touch. Let's gate and run. They said you could hear a woman's voice if you stood by the door at midnight, counting, tick, tick, tick. Some swore they saw a figure at the window in ivory silk, staring down at the street, not crying, just watching. But history doesn't like ghosts who tell the truth. So the story changed. They called her the Red Widow, a cautionary tale. They said she was wicked, deranged, possessed. They said her sisters were victims, her crimes unforgivable. They said nothing of the men who made her. Boston cleaned its streets, built new mansions, buried old sins. But the legend stayed, because legends are the parts of truth that refuse to die. And every so often, In archives or dusty libraries, someone finds a scrap of her handwriting. A letter, a note, always sealed in red wax. One found in 1902, beneath the floorboards of the old Whitmore mansion. Read simply, "If this story finds you, know that I never sought mercy. I sought memory, because if we forget, they win again. If this story unsettles you, it should, because it isn't about madness. It's about how cruelty becomes inheritance. It's about the quiet rebellion of women forced into silence until silence itself screamed, Eleanor. Whitmore didn't die for vengeance. She died for remembrance. And Boston never forgot her, even as it pretended to. If this story made you feel something, anger, sadness, fire, it's because the past isn't past at all. It's only buried under different names. Subscribe and share this story with those who still believe history was fair to women like her, because it wasn't. And maybe, somewhere the Red Widow is still counting. Tick, tick, tick. Time does strange things to stories. It burns away the faces, but not the feeling. It forgets the street names, but not the shame. 20 years after Eleanor Whitmore's hanging, Boston was a different city. Gas lamps lined Tremont Street. Steamships docked in the harbor. The factories sang day and night, iron clanging like a heartbeat. The air smelled of smoke, ink and ambition. But under the progress, something still whispered. They called it the widow's curse. Midwives told it in hushed tones. If a man lies and profits from a woman's pain, his daughters will pay in silence. Men laughed. Women didn't, because the city still remembered the name, not in print, not in sermons, but in the stories told over firelight. They said her ghost visited the rooms of widows, placed a hand on their chests and whispered, "Do not wait for permission." But the truth wasn't haunting. It was inheritance. The letter Eleanor left for her sister, Clara, survived, folded and refolded until the edges tore. Clara carried it across the Atlantic in 1855, hidden beneath the lining of her trunk. She settled in Le Havre first, then Paris, worked as a seamstress by day, a model by night, and in 1860 she had a daughter. She named her Eveline Whitmore. Clara never spoke of Boston, but every night she lit a candle before bed, whispered the same words, one for every promise they broke. Eveline grew up around paint and fabric, colors and words. She had her mother's eyes, that gray that seemed to hold both storm and silence. At 16, she began to paint. Her work was unlike the polite portraits of Paris, salons. Women in her paintings stared back. Eyes, unashamed, hands red with work, sometimes with blood. Critics called it unfeminine. They called her obsessed with suffering. She didn't argue. She just signed her paintings. In 1878, she exhibited a series called The Three Sisters. 3 women in white, standing in the rain. One facing the viewer. 2 turned away. Behind them, a mansion burning. When asked about it, Eveline said, "It's a family portrait." No one understood, but women did. They stood in front of that painting for long minutes, unmoving, because something in those eyes looked like them. In 1884, Eveline moved to London. Her art grew darker, muted browns, deep reds women painted behind glass. And one night, during a gathering of artists and writers, she met a journalist named Thomas Fallow. He'd heard rumors of her lineage. He asked her, "Is it true your grandmother was the Red Widow of Boston?" Eveline smiled. "They called her that," she said, "but that wasn't her name." Thomas became obsessed. He dug through archives, newspapers, ship records. He found the trial transcripts, the court drawings, the signatures. And in 1891, he published an article in the Strand titled, "The Whitmore Mystery, Bloodlines of the Red Widow." It caused a sensation. Readers devoured every word. He wrote that Eleanor Whitmore was a monstrous beauty who lured men to ruin. He called her crimes biblical vengeance. He made her legend marketable. Eveline read the article once, then she burned it. She painted through the night. When the canvas dried, it showed a woman standing in shadow, holding a burning letter. She titled it The Truth They Sold. Time went on. The world changed again. Wars came and went. The Whitmore name vanished from records, replaced by marriages and migrations. But the story, it never stopped moving. In 1920, in New York City, a feminist newspaper called The Women's Voice ran an anonymous essay titled The Widow Was Right. It told the story not as a scandal, but as rebellion. It described Eleanor as the first woman to repay men in their own language, the language of consequence. They said it was written by an artist in Paris. They said it was signed only E.W. By the 1950s, the Red Widow had become folklore. College professors debated her psychology. Writers borrowed her legend for novels and plays. Hollywood twisted her into melodrama, a seductress, a sinner, a ghost. Each retelling stripped her of truth. Each adaptation turned her into what men could digest. But the core remained. That steady, unblinking stare through the centuries. A stare that said, "You built this. Now watch it burn." In 1978, an archivist named Ruth Lanier rediscovered Eleanor's original letter. It had been found in a private collection in Salem, sealed in red wax. The owner thought it was a curiosity, a piece of female hysteria. Ruth thought otherwise. She spent 2 years authenticating it. When she finally read it in full, she cried, not because it was sad, but because it was true. The letter detailed everything. The men, the ledger, the deception, the sisters, and at the end, the line they called it revenge. It was remembrance. Ruth published the letter in a small academic journal. No one paid attention, not until 1985, when a Boston journalist named Carolyn Pierce turned it into a documentary, The Red Widow, Boston's Forgotten Fire. The film changed everything. For the first time, Eleanor Whitmore was not the villain. She was the mirror. Women across the country watched and said, "I know that feeling." Because the story wasn't about 1852 anymore. It was about survival in silence. In 2001, the old Whitmore mansion was scheduled for demolition. Developers wanted to build luxury condos on Beacon Hill. When workers began digging the foundation, they found a small tin box under the stone threshold. Inside, a locket, a ribbon and a folded note, written in ink faded to brown. To those who come after, remember what they called. Sin was often only self-defense, no signature, just a red wax seal. The discovery made headlines again, but the papers didn't mock this time. They called her Eleanor Whitmore, Boston's first rebel. And in 2010, an artist from Massachusetts held an exhibition titled The Red Widow's Legacy. 7 installations, each represented a stage of the story. Innocence, betrayal, blood, silence, memory, fire, and echo. The final piece was a mirror, image cracked, gilded, set in a frame of iron. When visitors looked in, red light flickered across their faces, and the sound of a woman counting played softly in the background. Tick, tick, tick. No name on the wall. Just 3 letters, carved faintly into the base, EWW. That's how the story survived. Through whispers, art, anger, and bloodline. Through every woman who refused to stay quiet. They called it madness. It was inheritance. They called it tragedy. It was testimony. Because every generation needs its own. Eleanor Whitmore. Someone to remind them that silence is not virtue. Silent obedience is not purity. That memory can be both wound and weapon. And maybe, somewhere in Boston, a child still grows up near the harbor, hearing stories about a mansion that once burned, about a widow who refused to bow. Maybe that child asks, was she a monster or a hero? And the right answer, whispered by the city itself, is and she was both us because they made her choose. If you've listened this far, you're part of her legacy now, because stories like hers don't belong to the past. They belong to whoever still feels the fire under their ribs. When they hear a woman was punished for remembering, that's how we keep her alive. That's how we make sure the counting never stops. Tick, tick, tick. There's a saying whispered in Boston cafes today. Every story told twice becomes truth. And in this city, truth is never quiet. It's 2025. Beacon Hill gleams with glass towers and coffee chains, but the ghosts still walk its bricks. Eleanor Whitmore's name, once whispered in disgust, is now printed on banners, hashtags, and art shows. They call her a symbol, a myth, a warning. But if you listen closely, if you really listen, she's still counting. Tick, 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 tick. It began again in 2019. A graduate student at Harvard, Maya Fernandez, researching early feminist resistance, found herself lost in the archives. In a box mislabeled Local Crimes 1850s, she found something else. Court sketches, letters. An unfiled page from the Whitmore trial transcript, missing for 150 years. At the bottom, written in the judge's own hand, the defendant's composure unnerves the men of this court. She speaks as if justice were beneath. Hermia froze, then she smiled, because she recognized that tone. She'd heard it in her own classrooms. That quiet, condescending voice that tells a woman she's too angry, too emotional, too loud, too much. Maya decided to write her thesis not on the Red Widow, but on how she was made. When her paper was published in 2021, it went viral. It didn't read like academic writing, it read like fire. She wrote, Eleanor Whitmore did not destroy society. She exposed its foundations. Men who believed women's bodies were family currency. They called her dangerous because she stopped playing the game. Within weeks, the name Eleanor Whitmore trended on social media. Artists made murals of her face, eyes grey, lips calm, rope still visible around her throat. Writers, filmmakers, poets, they began resurrecting her truth, and for the first time, Boston didn't flinch. Because in the world outside, the same wars were being fought again about who gets believed, who gets blamed, and who gets buried under silence. A podcast called Blood Memory: The Whitmore Chronicles debuted in 2022. Hosted by Maya and historian Dr. Lillian Cheng, each episode unraveled a layer of the myth. The tone was quiet, measured, like prayer with teeth. Episode 1 opened with the sound of rain and a woman's voice whispering, "One for every promise they broke." Millions listened, not because they loved history, but because they recognized the pattern. Different century, same story, different tools, same silence. The series inspired protests, documentaries, new research, but it also drew rage. Online forums called Eleanor a murderer, glorified by feminists. Pundits sneered that revenge is not empowerment. Arguments wearing new clothes. Maya read every insult. She didn't cry. She just wrote more, because that's how it always starts. First they call you mad, then they call you dangerous. Then they build museums around your name. By 2023, Boston's City Council approved a memorial on the site of the old Whitmore mansion. Not a statue. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted one. Just a courtyard, open to the public, with one wall engraved with her final words, "Tell Boston that a woman's memory weighs more than their laws." Beneath the inscription, a small brass plaque reads Eleanor Whitmore, 1921 to 1854. They called her the Red Widow, but she was really just the first to stop apologizing. Every evening, candles flicker at its base. Students, artists, mothers, daughters. Some leave letters sealed in red wax. Some stand in silence. Some whisper her name 3 times and walk away. Tick, tick, tick. In 2024, a DNA study confirmed something astonishing. Distant living descendant was found. Painter from Montreal named Amélie Whitmore. She didn't know her ancestry until the story reached her inbox. When journalists asked her what she thought, she said, "I think I've been painting her all along." Amélie's next exhibit was called Inheritance. 7 portraits, one for every chapter of Eleanor's life. Each face was half shadow, half light. Each woman's eyes were unflinching. At the opening night, Amélie said, "I wanted people to see what memory looks like when it refuses to die." Critics called it haunting. She called it home. And still, the questions linger. Was Eleanor Whitmore a killer? Yes, was she justified? Maybe. Was she the only one punished? Absolutely. Because in 1852, men wrote history in ink. In 2025, women are rewriting it in flame. In classrooms now, her story is taught beside Harriet Jacobs, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Sojourner Truth. Not as a saint, not as a warning, but as a question. What happens when a woman decides she's done being quiet? And maybe that's why she still matters. Because her rage wasn't random, it was precise. It was crafted like the barrel she once worked in, tight, contained, and ready to burst. There's a mural in Boston's South End, painted on a brick wall, 3 stories high. Eleanor stands there, not with a rope, not with a weapon, but with her hands open, palms blood red. Above her the words, they called it revenge. It was remembrance. Tourists take photos. Locals nod as they pass. Some don't even know who she was, but the city knows, because Boston never fully buries what it fears. It just renames it, and in whispers. She's still the Red Widow, not as villain, but as warning. Every October, near her death date, people gather in that courtyard. They light candles. They read her letter aloud, word by word. Sometimes the rain falls exactly as it did that morning in 1854. Cold, grey, deliberate. And when the last line is spoken, because if we forget, they win again, the crowd goes silent. For a moment, it feels like the city itself holds its breath. Then someone begins to count. Tick, tick, ticker. That's the sound of history correcting itself, not all at once, but one voice at a time. Every echo another heartbeat. Every whisper another refusal. Eleanor's story was never about death. It was about endurance, how pain becomes language, how silence becomes rebellion, how memory becomes freedom. If you walk by the harbor at dawn, you can still hear the water slap against the stones, one slow, rhythmic like a heartbeat beneath the waves. Some say it's just the tide. Some say it's her, counting, watching, waiting for the next woman who refuses to kneel. Because that's what legacies do. They don't rest. They plow through. If this story unsettled you, it means it worked. If it burned, it means you remembered. And if you remember, then maybe she never died at all. This was the wealthy widow who paid men to impregnate her sisters, Boston's darkest 1852 secret. Not because the story is old, but because it keeps happening, in different names, different rooms, different centuries. She didn't cry, she just remembered. And now so do you. Subscribe, share, and keep her name alive. And tick,